then Chuck comes back to Los Angeles,
Hmm.
and he brought with him a tape of Rickson's fights in the Valley Tudo, the no rules matches of that day, obviously way before the UFC.
Hey, let's talk about jujitsu when you first got involved because you got involved very early on because it didn't really start getting very popular worldwide again until like the UFC and MMA, kind of like in the mid 90s, but you were taking that quite a bit before that time frame.
Yeah, let me tell you the history of that. It's quite a story, but I'll try not to make it too long. But it all started for me with Chuck and Bob Wall and their wives going to Rio in 1988. Basically, just went for a holiday, just a vacation, as you'd say in America, not holidays. But anyway, so they ended up there, and Chuck said he was hearing all about these Gracies, and he's like, "Who are the Gracies?" Ba 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 ba. Cut to, he ends up in an academy with Elio Gracie, Rickson Gracie, Horion Gracie, Hoist Gracie.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine the who's who as we know
Yeah, sure.
today, but nobody knew back then. And so he's on in this school with them because he basically, and this is what I said to you earlier about Chuck. What I love about him, he's always so eager and open to the opportunity of learning something new.
Mhm.
Otherwise, he could have said, "No, grappling, I don't do that. I'm a kicker, or I'm a puncher." And he was just excited to sort of go and visit what he was hearing so much about as far as the martial arts environment in Rio at that time. And so he went there and he talks about it having a because Chuck's a black belt in judo or was at that stage. So he figured I can do a bit of grappling. He had a roll with Rickson Gracie and he said he got absolutely smashed. Rickson just handled him like it was nothing, as we well know, we understand why that is the case because Rickson
Sure.
is the warrior of the Gracie family. And then he talks about Helio wanted to have a little roll with Chuck. So they get on the mat and they're having a little roll. And in the middle of it, Helio apparently says, Master Helio says, and Helio was in his 70s then, but he basically says, Chuck, throw a punch at me, because Chuck's on top in the mount and Helio's underneath. And Chuck said, he's like, oh, Mr. Gracie, I don't want to do that. And he says he got talking, he sort of pulled his hand back half-heartedly to throw a punch. Next minute, Ilya's got a cross-collar choke on him. He said he just blacked out. He said he couldn't eat for 2 days. It was that strong. And
Wow.
Mr. Gracie apologized. Oh, sorry for being, a little bit hard. But so that was Chuck's intro to I mean, who gets to roll with Elio Gracie, with Carlos Gracie, of course, and Elio with the whole originators of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as we know it. So I thought that was a very funny story. And I'll tell you another thing that probably nobody knows. I don't want to speak out of turn. We've talked about this, but they were apparently talking before all of this and about, I guess Gracie's, Ilya were pushing about how elite a self-defense style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was. And they were talking about it. And he said, apparently, next minute, Bob Ball throws a front kick at Hoist, just out of the blue and says, and Hoist just jumped back because they were just having a conversation. He said, oh,
Sure.
what would you do if somebody did something like that? And Chuck says, Hickson fronts up and says to Bob, why don't you try that on me? And Chuck says he just freaks because he's like, "Oh God, no!" And by the way, this is before again we knew of how friggin' amazing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was. But either way, he said, "No, no, we just want to see, we just want to have a chat." I just laughed. Can you imagine that having Hickson step up to you and say, "Why don't you try that on me?" And it was just quite a funny sort of a move. So then Chuck comes back to Los Angeles
Hmm.
and he brought with him a tape of Rickson's fights in the Valley Tudo, the no rules matches of that day, obviously way before the UFC. And there was a particular one of Rickson fighting Zulu, who was this massive, black gentleman, a fighter. And, of course, Rickson won that fight. So Chuck brought it back. And I was training with Chuck because I think I told you I went to the States in 79, immediately started training with Chuck every morning at his house. So he comes back from the trip and shows me this tape, and we were talking about, wow, look at this stuff. This is amazing. So that was my first introduction to it. And I guess what happened then was Rickson came out to the States in, I believe it's like 1988. And
Mhm.
Chuck ended up inviting the Gracies because of conversations we had and how amazing it was to teach at his UFAF convention, United Fighting Arts Federation, which was held every year in Las Vegas. And even that, I think I've still got a picture of the guys there, but that was a who's who. For those who know jiu-jitsu, of course, it was Rickson and Royce and Horion, Pedro Sawyer. It was just, again, an amazing lineup. And that was really instrumental in getting Gracie Jiu-Jitsu established, I believe, in the US, because someone like Chuck, with his profile already with movies and as a martial artist, having the gentleman, the Gracies, and come out and teach at his convention was really quite notable and press worthy. And also, Carlos Machado was there too, though he came as just one of the people because Carlos, the Machados, as you know, are cousins of the Gracies, and they all trained basically together before the Machado split and became Machado BJJ. Gracie's kept their name. But I find Horion's number and give him a call in LA. And I rang him up and said, look, I would really love to see what you guys do. Horion was in Redondo Beach just before even they had any sort of academy. And I believe, and I only found out later that Higa Machado was also in Los Angeles, but I don't remember meeting him, though he remembers me. So I call Horion and I go around to the house, and that's when I'm introduced to Hicks and Gracie. It's just a garage at Horion's place. And I said, look, they knew a bit of background because I explained I was a karate guy, was kickboxing with Benny the Jet and people like that. And the first thing Hickson says to me is, my friend, you want to put the gloves on? Because this is when they had the Gracie Challenge, when they were basically trying to establish the efficiency of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu by challenging a lot of the local martial arts instructors, karate guys, and all of this. Thank God I was smart enough to say, no, no, no. I just want to see what you guys do. So that was the start of private lessons I had with Hickson, and this would have been in 1988. So this is way before the UFC that I started. And I always laugh. My very first lesson, Hoist was obviously just a teenager. They're very young, but they got me in the mount, as we know, just sitting on top of Hoist laying on his back, and I had to try and stay there without him getting me off. Then he sat on me, and I had to try and get him off, both of which were ridiculously impossible. There's no striking involved, of course. And I remember that day driving home from, I used to live in Hermosa Beach, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I felt like a little baby on the ground with these guys. I need to add this to what I do. And the important thing I pride myself in saying was not do this instead, but add it to what I already do. I just saw it as such an addition to my striking skills because I realized if one of those gentlemen got you on your back, you were fucked,
Sure.
if you had those grappling skills. So that was the start of that. So I trained with Hickson for quite a while in the late 80s, early 90s, and I went back to Australia and a friend had brought Carlos Gracie Jr. and Renzo Gracie to Australia. This is due to me coming back and talking up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So Renzo asked me, he said, oh, I told him I was doing some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Oh, who are you training with? And I said, oh, I was training at Orion's house with Rickson. Renzo says, no, you need to train with my cousins, the Machados, who I'd never heard of.
Mhm.
Henzo happened to be going back to Brazil via LA. So we met up there, and he was the one that introduced me to the Machados who were living in Redondo Beach. Again, I believe they first started teaching Hegan and Carlos and them in Caesar Gracie's garage. You know, he had a garage, and I can't remember whether that's where I started training in Caesar's garage or whether it was a house. I thought I remembered it's a house the Machados were renting. So there's three of them there. Jean-Jacques wasn't out in the US yet. You know, this is very early 90s. So I used to ride my motorbike out every day and train with them in their garage. And this was, you've heard of people like Bob Bass and Chris Howder, you know, people that became known as the Dirty Dozen, separate from the other Dirty Dozen, but the Dirty Dozen meaning the first non-Brazilians to get black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So Renato Magna was another guy. So I started doing lessons out there in the garage. Now, then cut two, I'm still training with Chuck every morning, and I say, Chuck, you need to train with these guys, you know? So he said, oh, set up a private, you know, bring them out to the house. So I took, I believe it was Carlos and Hegan out to Chuck's house. He was living in Tarzana then. And I remember him saying, yeah, book him for 2 hours. And I said, no, you don't want 2 hours. Meaning you wouldn't want to grapple with these guys for 2 hours, you know? So anyway, that was the start of the relationship that Chuck formed with the Machados. He then switched from the Gracies to having the Machados teach at UFAF. And it's a relationship that lasts to this day. He ended up going, you know, with Walker, Texas Ranger, and Carlos moved to Texas. He's now in Austin, but Walker was in Dallas, and that was the start of that.
Guys, get him.
And when when we were training with Chuck at Chuck's house with Hegan and Carlos and him, it was Bob Wall and Chuck and myself that basically set them up in their first academy, which was in Tarzana. And
Mhm.
I saw a report where it was Chuck bought their school. Well, that wasn't the case. It was a small shopping center or mall that Bob Wall managed, and he gave them a space rent free to set up their very first academy. Originally, it was going to have the Gracie name, but there was a bit of conflict about using the name. Hence, they started calling themselves Machado, RCJ Machado BJJ. And so that was the very first school. Eventually, Hegan and that because they were living in Redondo, they then opened an academy in Redondo. Jean-Jacques came out from Brazil in the early 90s, and he took over running the school in Tarzana, and that's where I stayed because I lived in the valley, and I trained with Jean-Jacques for, you know, over 30 years there. And I would still go out to Redondo and train with Hegan and the rest of them. And what an amazing journey that was. And, you know, I want to say too, I still have very fond memories of training with Rickson because he was so nice and kind. I remember him asking me, he said, "Do you know any judo moves, grappling moves?" And the only thing because I did judo as a kid, but I knew
Mhm.
the old scarf hold, you know, get the hook the arm and the head and the arm and get down low. And I remember him saying to me, he said, "Okay, put it on me, you know, and I've got this hold on and I was pretty strong." And he kept saying, "Oh, my friend, can you squeeze any harder?" You know, and I'm squeezing this on. He sort of did this back roll. It's hard to describe. He went like legs up near, went backwards. I ended up on my face with my arm up my back. And again, it was just a little demonstration of the skill these guys had that he wanted me to get the best hold on you and how easily he could sort of negate that. And that's another thing I sort of remember about all of that. So there you go. And look, it's been an incredible journey. I'm still doing jiu-jitsu. I've got Team Norton, BJJ here in Australia. I've got maybe 12 clubs affiliated under
Oh wow.
me. And you know, in Sydney and Melbourne, a few places, and I still absolutely love it. It's more doing my own thing, still very close friends with the Machados. I was lucky enough to present them with their BJJ Coaches of the Year at the recent Black Belt Hall of Fame in Los Angeles that George Chung is now producing, seeing he's the new owner of Black Belt magazine. And I see, Hegan all the time, and I ran into John Jack and the boys, and so it's been incredible. I'm a fifth degree or fifth stripe black belt with Hegan, and Rickson Machado awarded me a certificate as a sixth degree because of starting with him in the early 80s. I mean, he was my introduction to the whole art. And as I say, the journey continues. So it's been phenomenal.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, have you ever implemented any BJJ techniques into Zendo Kai at all?
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, it's yes. And more in earnest just of late. And I'm introducing and starting to train a lot of our guys up in more the BJJ combatives. Like obviously some of our students have branched an addition, added BJJ training at different places, but I'm more making it mandatory now for black karate black belts, I would call it, in our system to at least have a blue belt standard in the BJJ combatives. That's something, as you're probably aware, that Hannah and Hilon Gracie introduced with Gracie University, where it's it's more about headlocks, bear hugs front and behind, bend over headlocks on the ground, guillotines, how to escape. So it's the reality based aspect of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which someone like Rickson would argue is very much missing in so much of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today. And again, I don't have an opinion on that except that I understand that Jiu-Jitsu has gone and basically become such an incredibly complex sport with
Mhm.
people like Craig Jones and Gordon Ryan and people like this. And I get it, and it's an amazing art. But Rickson would argue that it's not the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu that they wanted to introduce, meaning that they at least wanted their students to have the skill set should they need it in the real world.
Oh,
Meaning
sure.
you're not going to start on your knees and slap hands and get into a half guard in a street fight. It's going to start
Let's hope not.
standing. Yeah, you're going to know how to enter and get a clinch and maybe take somebody to the ground. And more importantly, if you got taken to the ground as a stand-up fighter, could you survive and manage to get back onto your feet? Understanding that attacks these days involve not just one. It's not a one-on-one as in a consensual sports situation. It could be two or three, and then you could be on the ground having your way with a, Kimura or a who knows what with an assailant, and meanwhile the other two are kicking your head in.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly.
and the very first lessons I had with Hicks on half of every lesson were always what he called the combatives, or they've now called combatives, were headlock escapes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because that was, again, a lot of the jujitsu they brought in was tried and tested with real matches on the beaches in the streets. I mean, challenge matches. So they devised a lot of their techniques, or Ilio did, and passing along again through actual fights. So they were based not on theory, but actual things that they would get into on the street, hence the evolving nature of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with the combatives. And Hannah and Hilon, they won't let somebody get a blue belt in Gracie uh, uh, style as far as what they teach, unless they also get the equivalent of what they call a blue belt in Gracie combatives. And I remember doing going and visiting Hicks on this a long time ago when he was teaching at his son Cron's studio in LA.
Mhm.
I remember chatting with him, and he suddenly pointed out, he said, "Look," he said, "Rich, I've got probably four or five European world champions on the mat." He said they wouldn't even know how to get out of a standing headlock. And that is why he was always pushing that aspect, because that's what's going to happen in the street, as I said, and you don't have to get out, well, hardly ever a standing headlock in sport jiu-jitsu. So hence, a lot of people don't even worry about learning it, or always trying to make your technique work against an opponent who is pretty much just trying to punch you in the face at every moment. And as you know, with grappling, that changes everything. Look at MMA. Suddenly, there's a whole lot more to worry about with a
For
guard
sure.
pass or a guard defense if somebody's trying to punch in your face. And again, that was the original idea of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and of course, the Machados carried on that mantra as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So
I have a
anyway, Zendekai is incorporating BJJ combatives, and we're really pushing that. And it's also bringing it into the now. I mean, combat has always been, I think, a product of that combat environment of either that country or that era. And now, because of the UFC in the streets, there's every chance a kid, even though he might not do it well, is going to try and do a double leg on you and put you on your back. And if you don't understand the grappler's toolbox, albeit not even a good one, I think you're going to be like a fish out of water, hence the necessity of adding grappling into the stand-up fighter's arsenal. Because, as the saying goes, if you don't know a level change of a wrestler and what he looks like as he's going to shoot in, you'll be on your back before you get the first punch off, which Royce in the UFC proved. I mean, the amount of stand-up fighters that were negated with his grappling skills. And you look at it today and the level it's gone to now, it's just in another, it's bloody in another stratosphere. So I think it's a very important thing to add into at least our curriculum.
Oh yeah, for sure. For example, somebody mentioned earlier, Stephen One Boy Thompson. So, traditional karate background, amazing, karate fighter, stand-up guy, and he had a lot of success in the UFC because he focused a lot on takedown defense because he knew training and starting in his 20s and 30s, he's never going to be at the level of a top grappler compared to some of these other guys, right?
Yeah,
But if he could prevent the takedowns, he'd do very well. And that's exactly what he did. So he was able to
100%.
stuff takedowns with one of the best wrestlers, Tyron Woodley, for example. He had two shots at trying to get the welterweight title. Didn't quite, get the win, but he was at that level where he was fighting for the championship because he at least could prevent the takedowns, even though he didn't have great grappling. He at least not go to the ground. And then
And
he could focus on his great, amazing, high class, top level striking.
exactly, because if he's on his back, he's not doing what he does best. So, how smart it is to not go, well, if I'm on my back, I'll out wrestle these guys. Well, you're not going to, not those high level grapplers. So, the best thing is don't get there in the first place. So, start with learning what does it look like when I'm getting set up for a single leg, double leg, or whatever. Of course, you're still going to look at Khabib. Khabib took
Oh,
Conor.
he'll take anybody down, even a bear.
He took Connor down at will, and
Yeah.
Connor's one of the best defensive strikers in the world. So, depending on the level, but I would argue if you're in a fight with Khabib in the street, you're in a different fight anyway. So don't even.
You're in
Yeah, but
trouble,
but
yeah.
I think for someone like Thompson to do that, absolutely smart. And then I think it was Maurice Smith that told me when he started in one of the very early UFCs, he realized he could never be like a brown belt level grappler against the grapplers at that time, but he just wanted to learn how can I survive on my back on the ground with one of these guys and not get submitted. Because in those, as you know, they brought in the inactivity rule, which was really for the audience, not so much for the
Sure.
effectiveness of the fight, because it's a bit boring if you just see two guys lying on the ground. So after a certain amount of time, they'd stand them up. So he thought if he could like neutralize the activity and survive the grappler, up on their feet. Now he's back into chopping the legs and punching heads off. So exactly, it just made perfect sense for that to be, yeah, the strategy.
Yeah, exactly. One more question regarding BJJ, because obviously you were there at the time. You would know the story behind this. You were training a lot at the Jet Center, Benny the Jet, because there's a story that you hear that Benny the Jet was going to fight one of the Gracies. There's a big challenge back in the day, but for whatever reason, it never happened. So, what's the story behind that? You were there, with both sides during that time.